somebody asked me after class on Tuesday, well, how does this analysis apply if we have more than one child? Okay. By this analysis, I mean the investment that you would make in each child. And it's a question that's easy for us to answer within our framework. So let me give a little bit of a discussion of that. Suppose there are two ability levels, A1 and A2, and A1 is greater than A2. Boy, I will start out by assuming you know the ability of your children, and one child is A1 and one child is A2, and A1 is greater than A2. They're the same. There's no problem involved. If the utility function is the same, etc. You'll see it, but that will come out as a special case. Okay, so that's what we'll show. So the question that arises when you have this difference in ability is, do parents invest more? As think of the investment. Here we had a simple investment function. You get a higher marginal product. I mean, assumption we've been making all along. I mean, it may not, it's not logically necessary, but it seems like a reasonable assumption. So now the question is, who do the parents invest more in terms of the Y? Is Y1, that's the more able child, greater, equal, or less than Y star 2, and the stars are the equilibrium levels. Well, if you think about it, you can say, well, there are two types of forces involved. If the parents invest more in Y1, if Y1 is greater than Y2, the parent is taking account of the fact that it's more efficient to invest in the more able child. So from an efficiency point of view, you surely expect that. On the other hand, what's the other hand?
On the other hand, because like it's decreasing marginal utility from increasing like the child's earnings, so
Right.
you kind of want to compensate that.
So you have an equity, let's say that's an equity issue from the parent's point of view. That if you, even if you invested the same amount in each child, because one child is abler than the other, the human capital of that child would be greater. So for example, if Y1 star equal Y2 star implies H implies W1 is equal to W2 because they'll be equal to RH, and we know H1 will be greater than H2 by this condition, that F of A is greater than 0, right? So if they invested the same amount in each child, the abler child is going to have a higher income. And to the extent that the parents are concerned about, would prefer a more equal income distribution, I'll give you a formulation where they will in fact prefer that. To the extent they would, that's bad. You would think they would push back a little bit against the abler child under those circumstances. Right? How much they push back is something we'll have to get out of the analysis. Right? So it's like the problem of a social plan. It's very much the same problem as a social plan. The only difference is that for the parents, we can reasonably assume the parents have this utility function that depends on their children's welfare, and they're doing something like this. The social planner, I mean, that's an abstraction that we invent. What the political process is doing, who knows? Okay, but the parent is like the planner, social planner within the family, and it's worried just like we usually assume in the optimal tax literature and the like. A social planner is worried about what's the trade-off between, say, taxing the rich high and therefore having some disincentive effects versus the fact you'd like to redistribute to the poor if there was no cost no efficiency cost of doing it. So the parents have that problem, okay? Now to see that more clearly, very explicitly, let's assume, let's write the parent's utility function. Now we've only had one child up until now. So, but a natural generalization of this utility function would be that u of the parent is equal to little u be a parent plus a1 v1 of wc1 plus a2 v2 of wc2, right? So before we only had one. Before we only had one child, so and clear and natural generalization as it maintains separability. I mean, you don't need logically you need separability, but to maintain separability and to extend. Yeah, what's the question?
Oh, I was just, we're assuming that you can sort of make the more able kid help out more.
Well, I haven't said anything about that. Just hold that for a moment. I haven't made any assumptions yet, other than the utility function.
Okay.
Right? Yeah.
So you're saying if the one child one is abler than child two, and the parents invest equally in both, that the incomes of the children will be the same, or child one will have higher income?
They spend the same. If Y is the same for both,
Yes,
who do you think would have the higher income?
the abler child,
And
right?
why?
Because he's more able to. His human capital is higher.
His human capital is higher by this production function. If the child, if Y is the same and A is higher, then by this it says that H is higher for that child, so their earnings will be higher.
So when you wrote on the board W1 equals W2, is that
I
correct?
said if, oh, good point. Good point. Yeah, somebody should have pointed that out to me. That's not correct. Right? That's not correct. What I wanted to say, and I didn't say it here, was that if, not if Y1 is equal to Y2, but if H1 is equal to H2, that implies W1 is equal to W2. That can only be possible, if Y1 star less than Y2 star, right? Good point. Glad you pointed that out. Yeah. All right. Now, here, so look at this way I've written this function. Same as what we had before, but I allow now two kids, so there's an altruistic coefficient for both of them. I'm going to assume for much that they're the same, but they could be different. You may prefer the older child or the younger child. Whatever their ability is, you have some preference for them. And to assume, I didn't make any assumption about the utility function, but I'm going to assume they're the same V function. That I am going to assume. Kids have the same utility function. They need not. Parents will try to take that into account. So I can simply, I'm just saying 1 and 2 here, just so we're able to keep track of whether we're dealing with the utility of child 1 or child 2, but we're assuming they have the same utility function. All right, so now if there was a perfect capital market, the capital market assumption becomes really important again. If there was a perfect capital market, what would happen? Well, let's say you'd equalize the marginal returns on human capital in both kids, so perfect capital market. We know that R star 1 don't equal R star 2 may be equal to some R. We'll show what that is a little later on. Not this, maybe I'll get to it today. Right, that we're going to equalize the marginal rates of return. Now what, if we equalize the marginal rates of return, if we had a perfect capital market, what would happen to the incomes? Well, this would imply that assumption over there that the more able kid has a high marginal rate of return would imply that R1 star is greater than R2 star, right? Which in turn implies for sure that H1 star is greater than H2 star, or implies that V1 star is greater than V2 star. Okay? So in a perfect capital market, if all there was investment in human capital, this is what you would see. Now we come to the point that you were raising. It may be possible, as we discussed earlier, for the parents we don't have any other form of capital, so it's a little hard to see what the parents will be able to do in that case. But they may lend, one way to interpret it, they may lend money to the less able child to invest, or give the less able child some money to invest more than to the able child, and that the person who's borrowing more money has to pay it back. Let's say they borrow from some financial institution, help finance the human capital of the able child. They borrow less for the less able child because they give them more of a gift, and therefore that compensates somewhat for the difference in other income. So they could do all kinds of things about that. Okay? And if they can compensate dollar for dollar like that, they may end up, even in this case, with equalizing the utility levels of both kids. Okay. Now, suppose we didn't have a perfect capital market. And suppose parents couldn't leave debt to their kids. Okay? So this case assumes, you can leave debt that your kids have to repay. Suppose they can't do that. That's the more likely assumption in terms of seeing what goes on in the world. They can't do that. Okay? So they have to help their kids finance. They have to help pay for the kids. In other words, to invest in the human capital. Okay. Well, now let's see if we look at this problem here. And let's take a simple assumption that they're equally altruistic toward each child. Okay. Well then, given that V double prime is less than 0, if this were true, if the utility of child 1 was greater than the utility of child 2, the margin utility of child 1 would be less than the margin utility of child 2, right? Because of concavity here. So the parents may say, well, if this is my utility function, and I can get more utility to me from redistributing a little bit my investments in the kids toward the less able kid, because they have a higher margin utility of income, I might do some of that. Maybe a lot of that. And we'll see what it depends on. Okay. So that's, on the other hand, if I do too much of that, I'm giving up efficiency. Because it's more efficient to invest, in the more able kid because of these conditions. Okay. So what do the parents do? Well, they go through the first order conditions. So what would we have? Well, we have this. We also have WC1 is equal to RHC1 is equal to RFC1, and WC2 is equal to RHC2 is equal to RFC2. Okay. So that's the definition of our earnings that we have. Those determine the income. And parents then want to maximize, and the budget constraint of parents what is the budget constraint of parents? Well, it would be C of parent plus Y1 plus Y2 is equal to W of parent, right? That's all. Okay? So then maximizing the utility, subject to that budget constraint, we'll assume that we'll use a condition such that the marginal return is very high for small investments, so they invest something in each kid. Okay? All right? So then we can think of this as equalities, and we would have the usual one, U prime of CP is equal to lambda. Okay? And then we would have A1, well, let's now write it down generally, A1, D1, R1 is equal to lambda, is equal to A2, dV2, dy2. Okay? Or we can write this the following way. A1, V1 prime, which is dV dW times R F Y1 is equal to A2 V prime 2 R F Y2. The R's drop out. And so if parents like kids the same, parents like kids the same, A1 is equal to A2 is equal to A. So if we made that assumption, we'll show you, it'd be very straightforward to show how to modify this is true. These would drop out. So we'd be left with the first order condition here that V1 prime times FR1 is equal to V prime 2 FY2, or the margin utilities from income of each kid times basically the rate of return. I mean, the R, we put this in, we get the marginal rate of return on investing in each kid is equal, okay? So that would be our condition, given that we're equally altruistic. We're assuming the utility functions of each kid is the same, that if they were different, this condition would still hold, but the interpretation would be a little more complicated, okay? So now, let's ask the question, following question. Could it be true in equilibrium? That's the question. Okay. Well, it has a straightforward answer. If we'll show that can't be true by showing a contradiction. If this, then V prime 1 is greater than V prime 2, right? So if the abler child has less utility, the margin utility from the abler child would be greater. Parents would get more margin utility from the able child. The degree of altruism is the same. Right, now let's look at our first order condition. If this is greater than that, it implies that Fy1 is less than Fy2. That is, the marginal product of investing in child 1 is less than the marginal product in equilibrium of investing in child 2 is equilibrium, equilibrium, and therefore we have a contradiction. Now, why do we have a contradiction?
Because you're investing more in the less able child.
Okay, that implies the only way this could be true, since the child is abler and we have that Fya can either was greater than or equal to 0, that would still be true, we'd be investing at least as much and more, strictly more in that particular case. So we're investing more in the abler child. Okay, so this implies y1 star is greater than y2 star, which implies W, I'll write it all out, greater than W2 star, which implies V1 greater than V2, I'm sorry, V1 greater than V2, contradiction to the assumption that V1 is less than V2. So it can't be true. So in equilibrium, the abler child would end up with more utility. Okay. Not surprising. Why isn't it surprising? Because we go back to the utility function of the parents. They have this conflict. Suppose I had a really dumb kid. Okay. I mean, suppose that were true. There's almost no value of investing in them. So they're just throwing their money away by investing in them. All right? Now, we don't have any other way for them to be compensated, let's say, in this analysis. Okay? So you can't help them in any other way. But that's a reality of the world. So they would clearly going to invest more in the abler child in that case. Right? Even though by not investing anything in their dumb kid, the kid has very little utility. The margin utility of that kid from having more resources is very high. But it's not just the margin utility that counts. You have a productivity component. And how to achieve that margin utility, in the extreme case I get, it's impossible to get any margin utility. I mean, less extreme case, you can do it, but you're getting less bang for your buck by investing in a less able kid. So you have the efficiency forces push you to invest more in the smarter kid. On the other hand, if you invest too much in the smarter kid, then the margin utility, the smarter kid's income is much higher, the margin utility is much lower, and therefore you have an incentive to try to redistribute some. Because if you redistribute, other things you're saying, you pick up more utility by giving some more goods to the less able kid. So you reach a compromise between these two forces. That's what you're reaching, is a compromise between these two forces. Just one second. And what you're balancing, really, what are you balancing? Well, you're balancing the effect how much ability shifts out, the effect of delta A on the marginal rate of return. So how much it raises the marginal rate of return, the rate at which the marginal rate of return diminishes. That's the efficiency, the production, household production technology role in all this. And then you're also looking at how rapidly does the margin utility, what's the degree of concavity in this function? If it's a very concave function, so the margin utility falls rapidly as you invest more in the smarter kid, you have an incentive not to invest so much in the kid. So degree of concavity matters, and the concavity and cross derivative in the F function matter. Yeah, you had a question?
This is basically because of the way that the utility of the kids enter in the utility of the parents. Now, if we would have like a compensatory, a complementary relationship, then we would have a different result.
Well, I do have a compensatory relationship. Oh, I mean, it's entering in a very simple way. It's not the only way, but in a separable way. So the utility you get from one kid doesn't directly depend upon either your own consumption or utility you get from the other kid. You might bring that in, but it's still you're being concerned if you can get more, if one of your kids has low utility and high margin utility, other things equal, that leads you to want to do more for that kid in this analysis. So most of the usual things you would think about, we can get out of this analysis. So I don't see any reason to make it more complicated. You can do it, and some people write down a more general function. Basically, this would be what's going on.
I'm just thinking, like, in some families you see that the parents put all the attention in the kid that shows, like, deficit. I mean, for example, health problems. Or,
Okay,
and
all
this
right.
kid would be less able, but sometimes they just...
Could we get that out of this analysis? Could we get that out of this
I
analysis?
guess that they have a very concave function.
Yeah. Let me ask you the following question. Why? The amount invested. in Y1 and Y2, the amount invested in each child. What does our analysis imply? You investing more in the abler child, or less, or equal?
In this analysis?
Well, yeah, that's our analysis. I mean, so stuck with it for good or bad.
We're investing more in the able or not?
Why more in the abler? No, not in general. No.
Oh, no, you just said, oh, yeah, that's right. You just said that.
I said the income is greater.
Yeah.
The income is greater. We're not saying what Y is. We could perfectly well explain your phenomena, that it could well be, in this equilibrium, this was a contradiction. It could be in our equilibrium that Y1 hat is less than Y2 hat. Could be. Possible. That would be true if the marginal products fell rapidly, or the concavity of the utility function was very, very sharp. And if this happened, it still implies that H1 star is greater than H2 star. Even if that was true, we know that must be true. Why do we know that must be true? Why do we know that must be true? Eric? Why do we know that must be true?
Well, because we know that their income is going to be higher.
Yeah, we just proved before that their income has to be higher, right? So we've already proved that. This must be true. So you could, but we didn't prove that Y1 has to be greater than Y2. That we didn't prove, and you could easily give counterexamples to that. So I take your case. You spend more on the more handicapped child. Perfectly possible in our analysis, even without assuming that your degree of altruism differs between the children. Maybe it does. Maybe you begin to love your more handicapped child more. What would that mean? Well, that would mean, in our analysis, if we look at our equilibrium thing, it's really that A1, Fy1, B prime 1 is equal to A2, Fy2, B prime 2. And if, let's say, A2 was much larger than A1, A2 being, the second child being the less able child, maybe endogenously you begin to love, the A's may not be constant. In fact, a better analysis would make them endogenous, and one could do that. That how much you love somebody depends upon what their characteristics are. But let's suppose this was greater. And if that's greater, it's clear, and we work through the same sort of analysis, it makes it more likely that Y2 greater than Y1 as, let's say, the ratio of A2 over A1 increases. So in the limit, let's take another limit. The damn smart kid that you have, you don't like him at all. A is 0. Smarter than you are. A lot of parents don't like to have kids who are smarter than they are. All right? You don't like him at all. And if you don't like him at all, you won't invest anything in that child. Okay? Now, he may still have some human capital. And maybe a lot of human capital. Depends on the shape of this function that we have here. Possible. But in general, you'd think he'd have very little human capital. But he could have. But nevertheless, you'll be investing everything then in the less able child. So that's very possible. Or it could be the opposite. You really like your smart children. And you don't like kids who aren't so smart. So that reinforces your tendency to increase the income of the more able kid. And then maybe you're going to invest more in them. Okay? Yeah.
So, the parents get the same utility from both kids?
Well, if the A's are the same,
Yeah.
if the A's are the same, I just gave it a case where the A's weren't the same, but if the A's were the same,
So-
yes.
So you invest to make equals?
I mean, and also let me add something else. Before you go on, because we have to be precise what we mean. If the A's are the same, and the V's are the same functions, then V enters exactly the same way, AV enters exactly the same way for one child as in the second child. That's what we're saying.
So you invest to the point that you're going to make the incomes equal?
Are you asking or saying?
asking.
Okay, be careful. Sometimes you say, you want to make sure you're asking. Because it's good you ask, because it's wrong. You don't in general. No. You don't equalize income in general.
But if you're getting the same utility from them,
Yeah?
why you don't want to equalize their income?
Why? Well, let me ask you that. Why? You think about the analysis. Why might you not want to equalize it? I already really showed why you might not want to. In fact, I showed in general you won't want to. Not might not want to. With equal A's, you will not want to. Much stronger statement. Not mights, will not. Why not? Because what's the advantage of giving the able child more income?
That's the advantage.
Yeah, what's the advantage? To the parent. We're only worried about to the parent. Of course, each kid likes the parents to do everything for them, right? By assumption, they don't care about their siblings. You could add that in, and they have some concern, but they don't care about their siblings.
Yes.
Why is it to the advantage of the parents to give the able kid more income? Even though they like the able kid just as much as they like, no more than they like the less able. Because maybe even they like them less, up to a point than the less able kid.
Just
You don't know. You don't know.
rather than
It's more efficient to invest in the more able kid.
yes.
The marginal productivity is greater, so you get more bang. Yes, you like them equally, maybe even you like the less able better, but you don't get much bang by spending money on them. It's just not an efficient investment. And so that is the main force leading you to end up with more income for the more able kid. Not necessarily more investment, but more income for the more able kid. They'll end up with more income. You'll deviate because, look, it's like an envelope result. If you're investing, if they have the same income, they have the same utility, same margin utility. So if you deviate a little bit toward redistributing some of your investment toward the able kid, you're not losing any utility, but you're gaining efficiency. Let's say you're at an equilibrium. Here's a way to think about this. You're at an equilibrium. Human capital is the same. Earnings are the same for both kids. The V's are the same. The marginal utilities are the same for each kid. Marginal utilities being the same means if I take $1 away from the less able kid, give it to the rich kid, I'm not losing any utility, except to a second order effect, right? I'm not losing any utility. But by taking $1 away through investing less in the more able kid and investing more in the more able kid, I'm taking $1 away of investment away from the less able kid, I'm getting more than $1.
Yeah.
And therefore I'll never be at that equilibrium. That's another way to think about it. Okay? Yes?
I was just going to ask, so then, what it seems like the logic behind this is that the more able kid has a greater capacity to turn each dollar of investment into income at first, and so you invest a certain amount in him until the diminishing returns kick in, and with the less able kid, maybe there's an initial investment that doesn't generate income, but then it generates more and more as you go along, so it becomes more.
Well, no, it doesn't generate more. Well, it depends. It may generate more and more utility, but if we're assuming that the marginal product of investing declines as you invest more in each child,
Right.
then it is true, and if this is what you meant, it is true, that as you invest less in a less able child, the marginal product rises.
Right.
So that's a force sort of, reducing how much less you invest in a less able kid. And similarly, as you invest more in a more able kid, no matter what their ability is, but as you invest more in them, their marginal product is falling. And that decline in the marginal rate of return as you invest more in each kid is a force that sort of limits you from going to too much of an extreme. Absolutely.
Okay, and I suppose the logic behind it, my question is I want to know, so to make the amount of to have them both have equal marginal rates of return on investment, and to be...
Well, they're not going to have equal marginal rates of return in general on investment.
On the last dollar invested? Is that kind of...
No, they're not going to have that. They're going to have, what they're going to have is equal margin utilities. Let's say if
Okay.
the A's were equal, all right? A's are equal. This is our condition. So the margin, this is another way to write that, is that the dv1, dy1, is equal to v2, dy2. So the marginal utilities you get is the same from each kid. Not the marginal product of the investment, but you're balancing the lower marginal utility from an additional dollar you get from raising the income of the more able kid versus the greater marginal product of investing in the more able kid. That's the balancing. Because what we showed is this is going to be less than that, therefore this must be greater than that. The marginal product in equilibrium of investing in the able kid must be higher than that in the less able kid. Okay?
Right, and that's because the additional dollar earned by the more able kid provides less utility. To the
Yeah, it
investor,
provides less utility,
There's
absolutely.
less altruism in.
Because of the concavity, it provides less utility, and so the equilibrium would be you have to get a higher marginal return in equilibrium to compensate for the fact that you have lower margin utility.
And it seems like that implies some sense of altruism. You get more satisfaction out of knowing that the less able kid got $1 out of your investment than knowing that a more able kid got $1
Well,
out of your investment.
You're getting this.
Or is it the kids themselves?
I mean, this says the parents, look, multiply this times A and A. This is the margin utility the parents are getting from spending $1 more on the able kid. This is the margin utility the parents are getting from spending $1 more on the less able kid, and they're getting equal margin utilities. Equal margin utilities. Because they weren't getting equal margin utilities from spending on each kid, that won't be a maximum for them. If they're getting more margin utility from spending $1 more of investment on the less able kid, they'll spend more on the less able kid and less on the more able kid until they equalize it. Okay?
I was a little bit more about the intuition behind the difference in the marginal utilities of the dollars earned between the two kids. Like, why does it matter why does it change your utility if you know that a kid who's more able is getting that dollar that you know?
Well, it doesn't change the utility function, V. What parents have control, or they can't control how good a utility creator you are. What they can control, you have a utility fund. In fact, they can't control your utility fund in something simple. We aren't dealing with that here. All right, so what they can control is how much they're going to spend on each of you. All right. Now, the production technology tells them, they can't control that. That tells them, if I spend more on the less able kid, other things you say, I'm going to get less bang out of that. Less margin utility out of that. That's a force leading me not to spend more on the less able, to spend more on the more able. On the other hand, I also recognize if I give too much income to the able kid, the margin utility I'm getting from that is low relative to that from the less able kid. So that's not good either. So I'm balancing those two things. Okay? Yeah.
Would we have to change the representation of this model if we know that A1 is correlated with the concavity of B1?
I mean, we could assume a lot of assumptions, screwy assumptions. I mean, what do you want to assume?
No, what I have in mind is that if we know that that child actually likes studying and he derives a lot of utility from the study.
All right, maybe we don't have utility from studying in the analysis. Maybe you could put that in, so the utility function of the kid would depend not only on their human capital, but how much, I mean, we don't even have their time input directly into that. But we could extend the analysis, because it is a time input of the kid is important. And maybe the kid would get a lot of utility out of that. And then the question would be, not so much whether they get a lot of utility out of that, but what happens to the margin utility to the parents? It's not the utility levels that count, it's the margin utility to the parents as they spend an additional dollar on the kid, right? And so the sign of that is not clear, even if the kid's got a lot of utility out of studying, okay? What happens to the margin utility if you spend $1 more on the kid who gets a lot of utility? Are they getting more margin utility from the kid who gets more utility out of studying? I mean, maybe, but you'd have to specify that more. Okay. for the perfect capital market, you would, I mean, parents wouldn't have to worry about this utility problem from the point of view of optimal investments. All they would know is, let's say there's a rate of return out here, what R. Let's say that's a rate of return on capital. In a perfect capital market, the marginal rate of return on human capital is going to be equal to the rate of return on capital. Knowing that, then for each kid, you simply said R y1 is equal to R y2 in equilibrium is equal to R. That's all you don't have to solve this utility problem for that part of the problem. The perfect capital market separates out the efficiency issue from the utility issue.
So to achieve the utility first order condition, they have to like force transfer between the kids?
Yeah, well, they may, and in a perfect capital market, how would that function? The way it would function would be, you could think of two models of how that would function. A kid knows they're able, they borrow, and they make a promise to repay. Parents aren't even involved. Okay? So they'll be doing that, and in that case, the more able kid will end up with more income, even after they're borrowing. They'll borrow more, but they're getting higher rates of return. They'll end up with more income than the less able kid, and they'll both be borrowing to the maximum amount, but the more able kid is going to have more income. Another, maybe more realistic scenario, little kids can't borrow. The parents are contributing something to them and then making debt for them. Okay? And then in that case, given that there's going to be a difference in income, the parents will say, well, yes, but instead of giving as many, let's say I'm giving dollars for investment to each of my kids, instead of giving as many dollars, I can take $1 away from one kid and give that $1 to the other kid, right? And so I'll equalize. In that case, I'll have a tendency to equalize their utility levels through these compensation and how much I'm giving them.
So it's through inheritance basically that I will equalize the first order condition.
Yeah. If you have bequests, certainly if you have bequests, if there's another form of asset, and parents are maximized, they have two different kids, they will tend to equalize the marginal utility of consumptions of each of the kids. And we'll be able to show something like that. Okay. But we haven't done that yet. Any other questions? Okay. If society is thinking of redistributing, it may say, well, by taxing high earners, by taxing them a lot, I have big deadweight loss. That's an inefficiency like this. But I'm picking up some value from redistributing to the lower income people. So I'm balancing the waste that I'm creating by taxing higher income people from the benefits I pick from low income people. So the Murley's optimal tax problem is exactly that kind of problem. Right? So maximizing the simple Murley's case, you maximize some simple average of the utilities of different people, but they have different abilities. You don't observe them, but you observe their income, so you're taxing more high income. And now it turns out in his analysis, the very highest income people, you really want to have a zero marginal tax rate on. But that's basically the trade-off you're making between efficiency and what's considered social equity. Well, parents have to do that all the time, make that trade-off when they have kids of different abilities. Okay. Now suppose we had suppose the parents didn't know the abilities of their kids. Right? And let me take those abilities could either be A1 or A2. So only two abilities. And parents have two children. Let's say simple case where they think there's a 1/2, the ability can either be A1 or A2, and parents assume for each child there's a 1/2 probability of being each of them. Okay? So now, parents, let's say, are maximizing some expected utility over each of their kids. So it would be U (1/2) V1 V1. Let's say A is the same. If A equals A2 plus 1/2 A V1 if A equals A1. And similarly, for the less able, for the other child, now they're equally able in expectation. V2 A equals A2 plus 1/2 A V2 A equals A1. Okay. So they have two kids, they like them equally much, the V's are the same for each kid, the functions are the same. There are two possibilities on abilities, and they don't know, they have to make their decisions on Y. They have to now choose Y. They have to choose CP, Y1 star, Y2 star, okay? And they have to make that before they know which kid is able and which isn't, and which kid is less able. Before they know which kid had A1, maybe they'll both have A1 or A2, right? But there's a 1/2 probability for each of them. So there's some probability they both have the same. So, what would they do with their Ys? How much would they invest in each kid in this problem? Would this be true? That's the same amount? What do you,
Yes, I think it's the same amount.
why is that?
Because on average, both kids could either be A1 or
Yeah, so the
A2.
expected margin utility, there's now an expectation over the margin utility they get from that, and the expectation is 1/2 probability of A1, and they get a certain dV dy1 if A is equal to A1, plus 1/2 dV dy if A is equal to A2, and we have the same thing for the kids. Everything is symmetrical. So in equilibrium, they're going to invest the same amount, and that will give the same expected margin utility over each kid. Okay. So now think of what we did in the first case as, well, saying this is not 1/2. Suppose you expected that you thought one child had a 70% chance of being the able child and a 30% chance of being the less able, and vice versa for the other child. Well, then it's clear if this were, what would be true now? Well, now we'd have a similar, I mean, work out the first order, I'm not going to bother to do it, but you should do that. Work out the first order conditions now, you're going to see something similar to what we had before, but not exactly the same. You're going to weight the chance that child 1 is more able by 0.7 and chance that they're less able only by 0.3. And as you go to the limit where you weight it by 1 and 0 and 1, you have what we had to start. Right? So you can deal with the whole continuum. You can have a lot more, you can have a whole distribution of A's, and you're looking at, you have a whole bunch. As long as the parents, though, have some significant knowledge that one child is more able than the other, even though it's not perfect, and they have probabilities assigned to it, our results would follow, that the income of the more able, the child with the higher probability is going to be higher in equilibrium than the income of the less able child. Not necessarily you invest more in them, but the human capital will be there. Okay? So we can deal with that problem as well. Okay? And one special case would be, this would be a special case, with complete ignorance on the part of their parents throughout all their investments. That's not realistic. Parents do gain some assessment. Not only in extreme cases, but you see kids, maybe the first few years you can't tell, but after a while you do, and that will affect how you treat them. Doesn't mean you like one more than the other. Maybe you like the less able kid more, as we said before, and that will affect your equilibrium. But it'll certainly, you'll gain knowledge about who's the A1 and who's the A2, or more generally what their abilities are. So any questions? Yeah.
So the only thing that's important is that the parents are able to tell the relative abilities of the two children, not necessarily, it doesn't matter whether the probability is 0.7 versus 0.3 or 0.9 versus 0.1.
No, it matters. It matters. But the direction of the effect is the same in both cases. The direction of the effect, it matters, because if we take the case when they're both 0.5, and we said they'll end up investing equal amounts in each. And the expected utilities would be the same. There'll be realizations that you spend equal amounts on each. Some kid maybe is realized to be more the able one. Other kid is realized to be less able. That kid's going to get more human capital. Right? But you're spending the same amount on each. Now, as you change these weights and say, I'm 90% sure that child 1 is the able one. 10% I think they have lower ability, and say vice versa. It doesn't have to be vice versa, but say vice versa for the other kid. Then you're going to be closer to the problem we had before, which says you don't know how the Y's are going to be, but you're going to be certain that the child for which you have the high probability, it's not certain, high probability, a child for which you had 9.9 expectation that they're going to be able, a kid is going to have more human capital, more. That's what you can say. And you should work that out and let these probabilities vary. It's easy to do. So what I want to do now, though, is bring in something I've alluded to on a number of times, but haven't really considered much, unless there's some other questions. Any other questions on this? Yeah.
Just one remark on it. It's not only the expected ability, it's essentially also the variance, right? So if like one kid would face more variance in the ability distribution, then probably you would try to...
Variance was clearly affected. Absolutely. I took a very simple case. You had the 1, 2. But the variance was clearly affected because once you go into expected utility, the fluctuations is going to affect your expected utility. Absolutely. Yeah. Any other questions? I want to bring in now, because I think it's important and interesting. Let's say there's physical capital, another capital good, not human capital. Okay? Now, remember we said an important characteristic that we've assumed about human capital is as you invest more in any one child, you get diminishing marginal product. In that sense, there's not a market. I mean, all children are part of a market. It's true that we assume that human capital is aggregated up and becomes part of a market. So relative to, as I invest more in human capital, my kid, the little r, the rate of the return, the rental price on a 1 unit of human capital, I assume that's just given. That's a market-determined parameter. And you've got a whole bunch of different types of human capital. In general, that's going to be given to any one family. But the production of human capital, we say, is not a market. That's household production. There's a technology of each household, and that technology has diminishing returns. Okay? So that's very important. Different levels. It may not have diminishing returns, but have, let's say, ability affects the productivity there. That's also important. Or parental human capital effects. So it's not simply, or even only or even mainly diminishing returns. I could deal it with a lot of what I said with assuming no concavity in the y function, but y, the production f is affected by the human capital of parents and by the ability of the child. Okay, you get some things will be more extreme though in that case. Okay. Now, if we go to physical capital, financial capital, let's say physical capital, or financial capital is even clearer. That doesn't seem to be the right type of assumption. Yes, there's a market out there, but any one individual's, if I invest more, if I give a bigger bequest of stocks to my children, I'm not affecting the rate of return they're making on these stocks, right, or bonds, right? Because it's part of the market. I'm not even assuming, most of, finance doesn't even assume that, let's say, the human capital who's doing the investment affects the rate of return. That's too extreme, I think it does, but you would think it's less important than the way parental human capital affects the return on their kids. So usually when we deal with financial capital, we assume, well, there's a market determined rate of return, maybe not fully efficient and all that, all this literature now arguing about the efficiency of these markets, but there's a market there. People mainly take that as a given. That's why there are index funds and other type of activities. Because it doesn't assume it, as individuals be virtually impossible for us consistently to do better than that, right? So our human capital doesn't have a big effect. Now, in fact, people show it does have some effect. Affects the asset allocation. More educated people have a different asset allocation than less educated people, for a lot of reasons. So, but I'm going to make the strong assumption that physical capital is defined. I'm going to define it, or financial capital, whatever capital, there's some other form of capital, and it's defined as a rate of return RK. And that's the same for everybody. Okay? That's a market rate of return, the same for everybody. That's the assumption. I think in comparing human capital and other capital, it seems like a good approximation. That human capital is very personal, and other capital is more market-based. Okay. Now we know human capital, other capital that can be used as collateral. I buy a machine, I can borrow on that machine and give the machine as collateral. I buy a house, I get a mortgage. As collateral, I'm buying the house. So you can, because you can separate the capital from the individual. Okay. Now, what's the consequences for the analysis, and in particular for earnings and bequests? So now I'm going to allow what I'm going to allow now is parents to determine how much they're investing in the human capital of their children as before, but they can also determine that they can leave them a form of bequest other than in the form of human capital. They could accumulate K capital and leave that to their kids, or you usually call bequests. Okay? And we want to ask about the interplay between investment in human capital and bequests. Okay? Still assuming that parents cannot leave debt for their children. Cannot leave debt for their children. Okay? So taking account of the fact that there is a distinction between human capital and others, you can't borrow on the basis of human capital. Parents can give their kids a gift in the form of human capital, they can give them a gift in the form of other forms of capital, but they can't borrow on the basis of the human capital investment. Okay. So what are parents going to do? Well, Going to go back to the assumption of one child. Okay? So, we could carry through this the same analysis with more than one child. And it would be interesting, but at least for the rest of this lecture, I'm going to go back to the assumption of one child. And I'm going to go back to the assumption we originally made about the return on investment in human capital by assuming that if this is Y and this is RY, then this return gets very high as you make smaller and smaller investments. Okay? So no matter what RK is, if you make a small enough investment in Y, it's greater than RK. Right? You make that assumption. Now, it doesn't have to be strictly true for everyone. It may be a function of ability and so on. But to bring out a point, an important point, I think it's a good starting point. Okay? So in other words, Ry goes to infinity as Y goes to 0. All you really need is that Ry goes to something greater than Rk. And, I mean, that's good enough. So this is just an extreme version of it that allows you to apply it to all Rks. Right. Then one thing we know, if families have this type of utility function where they have some positive altruism toward their kids, and from before we know that every family is going to invest something in their children, in the human capital of their children. Every family is going to do that. Okay? All right. Now, that's going to be regardless of the human capital of the parents, regardless of the ability of the children, as long as some condition, as long as this goes to greater than RK. That's all you need. All right, so it's pretty weak. It's not no content, but it's pretty weak. Okay? What's going to happen? Well, let's go over the intuition, and we'll write down a couple of simple equations. Well, that means that all parents are going to invest something in the human capital of the kids. As the parents invest more in the human capital of kids, whatever the ability of the kid is, the return goes down. So if the parents become rich enough, at some point, they're going, whatever the ability of the kids are, whatever the human capital of the parents, as they become rich enough, they're going to eventually knock the marginal rate of return down to RK, right? Necessarily. Assuming the marginal rate of return is declining. I mean, now we're using the declining return. But if they do that, what do? Well, depends on what they're interested in. Suppose that parents really only are interested in what I'm going to call the total earnings of their kid. Now we have to be, we say total earning or income. Total income of the kids would be the income of the child plus RK times the amount of capital the parents leave to their child. Suppose that's what parents are interested in. That's not, and let's say, because that determines the welfare of the kids, the utility they get. That's their total worth, the total capital, human and non-human capital. Okay? No uncertainty in this, no diversification, because there's no uncertainty. Okay? So what do parents do? Well, they try to maximize that for any amount they're investing in their kids. Now they have two forms of investment. So we wrote down the utility fund, the budget constraint of the parents. Budget constraint of the parents is now CP plus YC plus R K of C. And I gotta have individual prices here, but this is basically what the problem is equal to I of the parent, and which would be defined similarly to that. Parents have maybe some inheritance they haven't earned it. This is what the parents have. And what they're maximizing is U of CP equal to little u, make this clearer, little u of CP, A, V of the child, only one child now, I is the child, I is the final way. That's the problem of the parents. Right? Question?
I'm wondering, in your budget constraint, should it just be KC, not R?
I'm sorry.
Yes.
Good. Yeah. I didn't mean to have this. All right. Okay, here. I occasionally try to test how alert you are. Thanks for being so alert. Yeah, no, it's not the R. See, they're given KC. The children would get RK times KC as part of their income. That's going to be their income. Okay? So the parents have to choose CP, YC, and KC. Now that they have a little more complicated problem. Okay, but not much more. So what do we know? Well, we know we also know, since they're going to have a positive amount of investment, I'm assuming A is strictly positive, that A, V prime of C, di dy of C is equal to lambda, is equal to u prime of C. They're going to invest some amount in the child. And we have another condition for K, that A, V prime, C, and we differentiate I'll do the same way, the K of C, that's going to be less than, I'm going to write that as less than or equal to lambda. If we're strictly less than, it means you won't give any bequest. Okay? So less than implies KC equal to 0. Now what does this condition come down to? Well, if we look at these two conditions, write it over here. Okay, we can say that A, V prime of C. Now di dkc is RK. Less than equal to lambda equal to that, less than or equal to A, V prime C, but di dyi is what? That's, from our equation, it's dwc dyi, that's simply ry. Okay. Ry. So this, and therefore we end up with a condition that the marginal rate of return on human capital in equilibrium is at least as large as the marginal rate of return on physical capital. Okay.
I got a little lost in the derivation. When you differentiate with respect to YC, WC is also a function
Well,
of
YC?
right?
YC, you saying?
Yes.
Yeah.
So WC is also a function of YC, right? In the analysis.
YC. WC, yes, it'll equal, WC is equal to R H of C. So when I differentiate that, I'm differentiating R H of C, that's R times dF dy, that's RY. That's the rate of return from additional unit of Y.
But that's not there, right? Because
Well, it
it's
is here.
equal to lambda.
Here it is. Here it is.
I'm a little lost.
Yeah. D, this term here. What is this term?
Yeah,
here?
yeah, sorry, I see.
Oh, see? Okay.
Thanks.
Any other questions? Yeah.
So, sorry, maybe you said this, but the kids can't turn capital, KC into HC.
No, because they only get that when they're adults.
Okay.
They get that when they're adults. Okay, they can't, but you'll see they don't have any incentive to turn it in anyway, as you'll see. They won't have any incentive to turn it in, but they get it when they're adults. So what does this say? Well, it says the marginal rate of return is higher. So we look now at, let's call this RK, and here's RY. RY is coming down. Maybe this is your optimal investment. Maybe this is your optimal investment. But you never go into this interval. You never go into that interval. You truncate that. So if Y is, let's say, is increasing in W, and we show it in general, or the income of parents, I. Y is increasing in I. As parents' income gets higher, they keep investing more in the kids. At some point, they hit this point, and from then on, they only give the kids bequests. Right? So if we looked at a function like the following, suppose it were true. Let's take a very simple, the one function we started from. Human capital is equal to f of y. Same for all families. Okay? Same for all families. Now what do we know in that model? Well, we know that, first of all, y star is strictly greater than 0 for all families. We also know, what do we know about this? What's the sign of that? Anybody? Yeah. What do you think? What's the sign of that? You, yeah.
I don't know. Negative?
You know, you do know. All right? Simple. Overly complicated. Now, let me put it in words. Parents have more income.
And they invest more in their kids.
They invest more in their kids, right? They want the kids to have more human capital. They want to consume more. They want the kids to be better off. The only way they can make their kids better off is as long as they're investing some, is up to a point, increase Y. So up to a point, we know they're going to increase Y. As long as Y sub, R sub Y is strictly greater than RK, we know a small increase in income will lead them to increase Y. Okay? So this is going to be positive. Okay? All right. So now let's draw a chart like the following. I have two of them. Here's income. Here's Y. What happens? So maybe it starts from 0, and goes up. It's a point. At that point, RY is equal to RK. Okay? Now we look at K. K is down here until you reach, let's call this point Y hat. You reach Y hat. K starts rising, maybe like that. This is K. So you look at the bequest. Bequest would follow this pattern. Okay. Investment in human capital would follow this pattern. Okay. The mirror images of each other. What it says is, up to a point, you only invest in the human capital of the kid. As you get richer than that, you begin to give them bequests. Okay. And you get still richer, you give them bigger bequests. Still invest the same amount. Remember, the only determinant of the productivity of the human capital in this simple case is Y. You can extend that. All right. So it says that bequests are going to be concentrated among the richer families. That would be an implication of this. That will survive a lot of extensions we'll make, which is what we do observe in reality. Most families don't leave any bequests other than human capital to their kids. A lot of money is given in bequests, but it's concentrated in like 10 or 15% of all families. We'll give a lot. Most families, the most productive way to give a bequest to their children is to give it in the form of human capital. We don't usually call that a bequest, but it is a bequest. It's not taxable, so you have a tax advantage of doing it that way along with every other, right? But even if we show, even if there wasn't a tax advantage, there would be an incentive up to a point to do that. As long as you're willing to assume that for low amounts given, you get high rates of return on that investment. Yeah.
That broad implication makes sense to me, but in my own experience, I feel like parents tend to invest to the point where RY is less than RK. I mean, I don't really have a good way of judging that, but I get the sense,
Why do you think it's true?
Well, I think it's harsh. I mean, my
RY
guess
is
is that
less than RK? You think the rate of return on, let's say, investment in education is less than the rate of return on physical capital in the United States?
not with everyone, not with, but I've had some sort of friends from rich families, and I think their parents like invested way too much in there compared to what the market return would be.
Well,
I mean,
I don't know how you're making that judgment. Maybe they weren't good students. The question is, they may have some assets they have to manage, that the college education improve their ability to handle these assets. I mean, I don't know. To answer that question is a difficult question, is all I'm saying. Maybe you're right.
Well,
You're right.
my feeling was that the human capital of the kid entered directly into the parent's utility function, not
Yeah, I
not
know.
necessarily.
It could be. It could be, but I'm saying it's not obvious we have any evidence that really indicates that. I mean, I don't think the first thing that jumps out of looking at rates of return on human capital, particularly on education, is what you would be thinking about, is that these rates of return are low. The first thing that jumps out to me from looking at the rates of return on education is how high they typically are. And we'll show that, not only in earnings, but in other forms. Now, maybe for some families it's low. And there are a couple of ways. Suppose it was low. There are a couple of ways to try to understand that. One, maybe they get some utility itself from having more human capital of their kids, right? So we'd have to extend what the parents are getting as opposed to what the kid is getting. But there's a way to do that without making that assumption. But making another assumption which might be particularly appropriate for rich families. Well, maybe what I'm saying has been so vague up until now, but let me tell you what I have in mind. Suppose one advantage, I'll come to this a little more some lectures now. Human capital is embodied in the individual. You have it. You may be a guy who visits Las Vegas all the time and you're gambling away. But you can't gamble away human capital. I mean, you can waste a lot of your time going to Vegas, gamble away all your wealth. You can't gamble away your human capital. So if I'm a parent, I'm saying, look, I have a problem. I'm altruistic toward my kids. I have a commitment problem. If I give them a lot of money, bequest, and they go blow it, they'll come to me, Dad, I'm stuck. I don't have much money. Can you help me out? And I'm saying, well, what the heck did you do all that for? But I'll give them the money, probably. On the other hand, if you say, look, I'm going to cut down what's sometimes called the Good Samaritan problem. I'm going to cut that down by giving you your capital in a form you can't blow so easily. I mean, nothing's foolproof, but you can't blow it so easily. You have this education, okay? You can't go to Las Vegas and blow your education, right? You can't marry some gold digger, as they say. You end up giving all your wealth. So I'm offering you some protection. Then it would look as if I'm getting a low rate of return on that human capital, because I am getting a return. The kid is getting a more complicated return. Because in a sense, the kid is getting a lower return because they have this capital and they can't blow as much when they're younger. So maybe that's going on for some families, that sort of thing. So it's not either the parents are getting direct utility out of it, it's really trying to solve a maximization problem over time when there's altruism. I'll probably say, I'll discuss that more systematically. Some of you don't follow it, wait until later on. And maybe for some, they get utility out of the kids you have. But nevertheless, when you look at the data, it doesn't jump out from the data that rates of return on education are particularly low relative to rates of return in other parts of the economy. And I'll show, in fact, they're quite high on the average. There may well be exceptions that we don't have the data that can indicate. Yeah?
Well, wouldn't the fact that the wealthier of the top 10% of the ones that do bequest kind of leads the evidence to that RY is actually higher than RK, not only for the lower, but up to
At all levels?
Up to the high,
Well,
to that highest level.
well, yeah, I don't know. I mean, what this theory, what this analysis suggests would be, and I'll continue with this on Tuesday. This analysis suggests is why the rates of return, marginal rates of return, may be higher on the low income, higher for kids from lower income families. And that's based on the fact that bequests are concentrated among higher income families. So given that bequests are concentrated among higher income families, even though it is true that higher income families have more education and more ability for the reason, the equilibrium analysis I gave, even though all that's true, if bequests are going to be concentrated among them, it must be, if this analysis is relevant, that on the whole they're getting lower marginal rates of return on human capital investments in their kids than on the return on bequests. They start giving them some bequests. And so that enables us to come back again. Remember, in our early analysis, all we had was human capital. We said, well, we can't be sure who's getting the higher marginal rate of return. The more educated parents, the less educated parents. The kids with parents with more able kids, or less able kids. Now we can give a result that on the whole, the marginal rates of return are lower in the more higher income combined with more educated, more ability kids. On the whole, they're lower in there. Now, there'll be exceptions. Families that really able kids don't give any bequests, even though they have pretty high income, they get a lot of education and so on. So on the whole, that has to be true. Okay. All right, so let's continue on Tuesday.